I think get started.
Yeah.
Let me drop the slide.
So welcome everyone, and thank you for coming to our author talk with Joy Ma and Dilip D'Souza. We'll begin with a reading from the Deoliwallahs, and we'll end with Q&A from the audience. Your microphone and video will be turned off, so please submit your questions in the chat found at the bottom of the screen. For those who would like to access live closed captions for this event, please click on the CC icon in your Zoom toolbar and click on Show Subtitle.
We're happy to welcome Joy Ma and Dilip D'Souza to San Mateo County Libraries and are eager to learn more about their co-authored book, The Deoliwallahs, sorry, the true story of the 1962 Chinese-Indian Internment. During India's war with China in 1962, India imprisoned around 3,000 Chinese Indians in a camp in Deoli, Rajasthan, purely for looking Chinese. Nearly 6 decades later, survivors are sharing this part of Indian history that's almost completely forgotten today.
Joy Ma was one of the few children born in a Deoli internment camp and has studied at the Lady Shri Ram College in India and a new school for social research in New York. Joy lives in the Bay Area with her family and enjoys traveling, writing, climate activism, and good food. Dilip D'Souza trained as an engineer at BITS Pilani and as a computer scientist at Brown University, spending more than a decade in the US before returning to Mumbai. Dilip is an award-winning writer and journalist, writing on social science issues, science, sports, and mathematics. So thank you for joining us, Joy and Dilip.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for joining. Okay. So I'm going to share a small presentation I prepared. Okay, presenting it. Okay. Thanks for attending, everyone. We're going to talk about the book that Dilip and I co-wrote. The title of the book is The Deoliwallahs. And what it means is, it literally means the people of Deoli. Deoli was the town in which the camp was situated, and having lived there for several years, we were the people of Deoli. The book was published in January last year by Pan Macmillan India, and the photo you see over there is my parents and my brothers before they were taken to the camp. The photo was taken in October of 1962, and also before the war. So Minyi went over this. I'm not going to go too much into that. So I just wanted to give a quick view of what happened, a really brief snapshot. There was a war between China and India in 1962 in November. And following the war, 3,000 Indians of Chinese descent were interned from the eastern regions of India. And these areas included Assam, Shillong, Darjeeling, and my mother's hometown, Kalimpong. The camp itself was a disused World War II POW camp, and it hosted, there were people who were put away from the armies of the German and the Italian armies. And also a lot of freedom fighters were imprisoned in Deoli. So I just wanted to give you a sense of where all this is spatially. So in this area, this is where everyone was incarcerated from. So you have Assam, you have Shillong, Meghalaya, and then this is the Kalimpong region. And the Chinese were taken all the way across the country to Rajasthan. And this is approximately where Deoli is. It's a little bit south of Jaipur. And then a little view of the state. Here is Deoli, and here is Jaipur, and another big city is Ajmer right here. What did the camp look like? These photographs were taken in 2012, a little bit before the anniversary of the war in India, the 50th anniversary. So these were the barracks. Each family lived in one of these units, and then they lived next to people who were sort of from the same area. And then there also was a cemetery. There were people who passed when they were in the camp. And so that was definitely a part of what the entire area looked like. I added this photo because it's a photo that was taken because we stayed so long in the camp. We were released in 1967, and at that time there were very few people left in the camp, and so the families remaining would be taken for excursions, and this excursion was to Jaipur, and my parents thought they should take a photo of us. Photos in the book. And then with that, just wanted to give you a snapshot of what's been said about the book. This is actually on the book jacket cover by Bhanu Mehta, who's a very well-known person, in a writer and a great, wonderful person. So what he says is it brings to light a forgotten chapter of Indian history, and then one we need to remember in these troubled times. And Dilip and I are going to go into it a little more about why, besides being a story that most people don't know, why it's more relevant today than ever. And thanks for attending. I'm going to turn this off and stop sharing. Okay. So the first portion I'm going to read is from the prologue, and I read about it because I wanted to share how I came about to write this book. It was actually very, very difficult for me to write the book, and so wanted to share the journey in doing this. So the little section is titled, "How Do I Begin?" I went back to India for the first time after I finished college in 2012. It had been 25 years, and I couldn't recognize Delhi or the areas I used to know in the 3 years I lived there. During my visit, I met my friend Kai Fries, who was then an editor at Outlook magazine. We went out for lunch. I ordered a dosa and Kai a thali meal. There was a lot to catch up on. Even though Hindi came back to me with total recall, I had to rediscover the familiar in a sea of newness. Our conversation meandered around friends, what Kai was doing, what I was doing. When we were ready to leave, he told me he was editing a special section on the 50th anniversary of the Sino-Indian War and asked me if I wanted to write on the subject. My first instinct was to run away, to run further than I had when I left college. I said, "No, I can't talk about it. I don't want to." "We don't need the story right now," he said, "but if you want to write or know someone who would write about the camp, let me know. We're looking for a first-person account." Kai's request haunted me for the rest of my trip. When I went home, I asked my mother if she wanted to tell a story. She said yes. We sat down and she told me again about the day the family was arrested. It was like I was hearing it for the first time, except it wasn't. I had heard it several times before, and every time, even now, it sends chills down my spine. We were exhausted and in tears by the time she ended her narration. I sent Kai the article and the magazine published it. I then sent it to everyone I knew. This was what set it all off. For years, I had been writing about my family's Deoli experience in the form of fictional pieces based on my knowledge of the camp, which I never sent out for publication. These writings skirted around the real issue to really tell the story. For decades, people have been asking me about my book. From the moment I went to school, everyone seemed to expect that I should write about it. But no one was interested in the topic in the US, and as a result, I didn't. And frankly, I couldn't write about it. There were several reasons. When I was younger and met people who knew I was born in the camp, excuse me, they would look at me with what I could see was a mixture of astonishment, sympathy, and sadness. The astonishment was because I had grown up from being the child everyone thought was a boy, given my utilitarian shirt and pants. The sympathy sprang from survival's gift, if they had not been interned in the camp, or from the memory of a shared experience. And the sadness came from their knowledge of my family's lost years, and from my family's situation. They had lost everything. Even today, not everyone is comfortable telling their story. It remains bottled up within their circles. Some ex-internees will not travel back to India. Others will not talk about it, turning away from the bad memories. Others are simply afraid. The most difficult hurdle to overcome was the stigma of being imprisoned in the camp. It followed us for years, clouding everything we did, even when we actively kept it away from our lives by not talking about it to outsiders. In the beginning, people were afraid to be associated with us. Like with Ying, Michael, Stephen, and the others in the book, who were bound by this common experience and remember being in the camp, it was humiliating and terribly isolating. This makes it incredibly difficult to find the right frame of mind to approach that episode. I was finally able to overcome this by finding the larger camp community and with the support of friends who helped me see the path to start writing the book. The camp is something I lived with from the earliest moments I can remember. I was 4 when my family was released, and I have no memory of it except for one image. My point of view is close to the ground, and I'm looking out to a vast brown expanse. I know my mom or dad is behind me, supporting me. When I became a teenager, a part of me wanted to dissociate myself from the camp. Every time I met people who were from the camp or family friends who knew about the camp, the conversation would eventually go back to the camp. And they either asked me to write about it or asked about the book. Okay. I'm going to pause there. We thought we'd break it up and Dilip and I would chat a little bit about it. And we'd love your questions, so please do ask.
Joy, I've read this and, and we worked on it together, but something I've always wanted to ask you about this and all you others who talk about, who've all emigrated from India. So question I have actually is, when you come back here, when you came back on your trips, what do you feel about this India, about this country that you must feel somewhere inside betrayed you? What do you feel about returning back to India? What does Stephen feel?
So I'm going to read about Stephen's experience next. And for him, it was really difficult. But for me, it was a little bit different because I was, I was brought up in a school. I had friends. I went to college. So so even though it was in the back of my mind, I think it affected my parents were more sensitized towards it. I was only sensitized in the fact in the situation where I knew I couldn't really talk about it. But other than that, I'd compartmentalized it. Everything was fine. When you're in the company of friends, they just their own people, and they have nothing to do with that experience. So I never really felt any bitterness because so much of my life had been sort of assimilated, with being a student, with figuring out where to go next. So yes, but of the other people, I think it was a really emotionally draining journey to go back. we had gone, and that's where we met you. It was 2015, and there was Stephen, who did not talk about it for like 40 years, and there was Ying, who wrote her own book, and it was just this excruciating experience. And then with Michael, you know, when you read the book, you just know how it affects him. So even though he overcame it and he was really successful, it just hung around him. And I think that journey was, that trip was very, very healing. And after that, everyone's attitudes changed a lot.
Okay. Do you want to go on with your next, with Stephen's reading, since you mentioned that?
Yeah, let's do that. So there's Stephen Wan. So I'll dive right into his chapter. Basically, his family lived in Kalimpong for several years until 1962, when they were interned. So here goes. By the time Stephen Wan's family had to leave to be interned, this town, Kalimpong, where Tibetan and Chinese traders and their families made their homes, was no longer a quiet trading post that came alive only when the mule trains from Tibet arrived. The town had changed. After 19th November 1962, things would never be the same again for Stephen Wan and the other Chinese who lived in Kalimpong. I met Stephen briefly during the Association of India Deoli Camp Internees, the AITCI's 50th anniversary gathering in Toronto, but I didn't get to spend time with him until we traveled to India in 2015. By then, he had retired, and one of his goals for the trip was to go back to Kalimpong after exactly 50 years. During our trip, I learned that Stephen had not spoken about his experience to his acquaintances or his colleagues at work. It was a part of his life that he carried with him, but like many of us, he did not talk about it outside his immediate circles, his family, and those who shared the same experience in Deoli. While in Delhi, he told a reporter about how he felt, the burden of humiliation he carried, and broke down. He was on a panel on the television station NDTV with Ying Marsh, an ex-internee, and spoke about returning to India after all those years. Except for his oldest brother, Yung Chui, who was working in a jute mill in Calcutta, Stephen's entire family was taken from their house in Kalimpong at midnight on November 19th. There were 11 of them, his father, mother, and 9 siblings. The policemen who came to the house instructed them to pack a few clothes and made sure to repeat that they were not allowed to take too much with them. In shock and sick with worry, they hurriedly took only what they could each carry. Stephen remembers the siblings with one small bag each, packed with their clothes. After the police finished inspecting the family and their belongings, they were loaded into a lorry with 9 other families. They reached the Kalimpong police station at 3 a.m. Then they were taken to the Darjeeling jail, where they arrived at 8 a.m. Once in the Darjeeling jail, the police registered all members of the family. They took down names, birth dates, recorded where they had lived, and told them to declare and hand over all their money. Although they had declared some money before, the jailers discovered and confiscated the rest of what they had. For this, Stephen's father was punished and put in solitary confinement for 3 days and nights, an agonizing memory that is seared into his mind, which he still recalls vividly today. They never got the money back from the jail staff. The women were separated from the men and sent into a separate section of the jail. The men were put in a big open space, which was like a house. There they slept, all of them side by side, with many other people who had just been brought to the jail. Stephen noticed that they were all Chinese Indians in that section of the jail. There were no other prisoners. He noticed that most of the people who were arrested were locals like them, most of whom he recognized. He was almost 17 at the time, and what he remembers most about that early time in the camp was how confused he felt. No one told them anything. They didn't know where they were going to be taken. There were so many questions. The adults kept asking each other because there was no one else to ask. Were they going to be there, wherever it was, for weeks or months? Where were they going? When were they going? There was absolutely no information, no communication with the outside world during their time in Darjeeling jail. They were completely lost. He doesn't remember the exact date they left Darjeeling. It was most likely 10 days from when they arrived. At that time, they did not know what day of the month it was, much less that they were going to Deoli. When they finally boarded the train to Siliguri, Stephen saw that many other Chinese families and the single men had been gathered from Shillong and Assam. He then realized why they had been waiting all this time. The authorities had been rounding up all the Chinese to fill the train. We'll stop there.
Joy, I'm going to pick up on two dates that you mentioned in that little reading. I mean, the same date that you mentioned twice, 19th November, November 19, 1962. The reason I wanted to highlight that is because, as you know, but maybe some of our listeners don't, the war was actually over then. The war officially ended, I think, on the 20th of November. So this month-long war, and here are these guys being picked up and sent to prison after the war was over. I mean, do you think Stephen and his family knew that? I mean, that they were heading off to jail, to this prison after the war was, for which they were being imprisoned, was actually over? And what did they think about that? And all the others who you write about.
Yeah, so I think during the general internment, which happened on November 19th, most of those people didn't know what was going on unless the news was coming out. And so I think everyone was anxious and they expected something to happen, but they didn't know what it would be. However, for my parents who were arrested in the end of January, for them, it was a total relief because the war had ended, right? And they, but their workers had been taken to Deoli, but they felt that now that the war was over, nothing else was going to happen. But what they didn't expect was it continued to happen over the next couple of months. So I don't know. I should probably ask Stephen whether they had a sense, because I think the dates are so close that they may have expected some relief and maybe not.
And to take that point further, you in particular spent 4 years. Not only was your family sent there 2 or 3 months after the war was over, but you spent the next 4 or 5 years in prison. I mean, that's even more ludicrous, it seems to me, from all these years later, that you spent time in so long. I mean, after the war was almost a forgotten memory by the time you came out of prison. So, I mean, what sense does that make in your mind?
We don't. Yeah, it's really a mystery and baffling. We have some idea of what it might have been, but to your point about how everyone had forgotten about it, during one of these trips to Jaipur or Ajmer, there was this man I write about in the book. He came over to my parents because it was, they were being escorted by a bunch of police or army, and he said, "What are you doing here? What's going on? It's like 4 years later. How are you? They're still keeping you in this place?" And so he proceeded to talk to my parents, and then he was soon shooed away. But it was such a random meeting, and for my parents, it was just horrifying because he was somebody from the outside, stating the obvious. Why aren't you returning back? And I think for my father, he wanted to go back to where he was picked up from, because everyone wanted to go back and start their lives again. But many of these places were declared sensitive areas, and a lot of people were not released. They were all released to Calcutta, where they had no homes, and some situations, like our family, we didn't have many close relatives. We had some friends, but and then they were all released with no resources but whatever they had managed to hide or make while they were in the camp. So yeah, our family was the last to leave the camp, and with them, I think they At that point, they didn't even know what to do with these last families, and they closed the camp after that.
Again, carry on. You have another reading, right?
One more reading and then questions. All right, here we go. All right, so this chapter is about my family, and it's titled Effa and Jack Ma, my parents, this side or the other. One day in 2017, when I was talking to my mother, we started arguing. I was referring to former Prime Minister Lal Bahadur Shastri during one of our conversations about a book, and she corrected me, saying that he was the Home Minister. We went back and forth arguing about his title until I realized that the change had happened when she was interned in Deoli, and she never knew that since his visit to Deoli camp, Shastri had become Prime Minister. Caught completely off guard, tears welled up as I wept silently, again for the hopeless years Mom and my family had lost, and for finally understanding why Shastri's visit to Deoli was so unforgettable for Mom and for many others in the camp. It was heartbreaking for me, excuse me, to see how she realized there was even more she had missed during her long years in Deoli. She didn't speak for a while. Shastri's visit to the camp in 1963 was a story I had been told so many times by different people that I felt I knew it very well. I felt connected to Shastri because when I was in high school, I won second place in the Lal Bahadur Shastri short story writing contest. I already knew of his visit to Deoli, and there seemed to be a reason that my story broke through the thousands of entries in the contest created in his honor. It was, by the way, a pretty bad science fiction story about haunted twins, which is thankfully lost because our class teacher misplaced it. On June 9th, 1963, after a second batch of internees left for China, Home Minister Lal Bahadur Shastri visited the camp. Mom remembers him as a man of medium height who was soft-spoken. A crowd of internees had gathered to listen to him, hopeful that a man of such high standing in the government finally visiting the camp would bode well for their situation. Mom and Dad stood at the back of the crowd. Over a loudspeaker, Shastri spoke about the plan for the internees and that those who chose to stay would be returned to their homes. He asked those who wanted to stay in India to stand on one side and those who wished to go to China to stand on the other. The people who wanted to go to India would board the last ship, one that was yet to arrive. The effect of his words was electrifying. Everyone started talking at once. Astonishment rippled through the crowd as they dared to hope, after being banished to a place that they themselves had never heard of until they arrived, for what they had only imagined for an impossible, unattainable choice, to go back to their homes. The internees eagerly sorted themselves, standing where they wanted to be, establishing undrawn lines. My father's face lit up. There was only one thing he wanted from the few options presented to him, and that was to pick up his life from where he had left it. He and my mother stood on the India side. After the internees had taken their sides, Shastri thanked them and promised that those who chose to remain in India would be sent back to their homes to go back to their lives and livelihood. The rest would board the last ship to be repatriated to China. For years, my mother had spoken of his visit and how nothing happened. The memories of those who tell me the story are clear and their disappointment tangible. For Mom, I could tell that she saw our continued internment after that visit as a broken promise. She never forgot how excited the people around her were when they were offered the chance to remain in India. So many people wanted to go back to their homes and carry on with their lives, and she always asked, how could the Home Minister promise to send us back and fail to deliver? How could he bring so much hope to the most forgotten people in the world and not know what he was doing? What could make him break such a promise and in doing so, break people's hearts? Looking back, I realized the gaps in our knowledge were because we had received little or no news in the camp. Newspapers were censored and full of holes, barely held together by razor-thin strips of newsprint. When she got out of Deoli, she had to struggle so much that following a politician's career was the last thing on his mind. Years after she was released, she learned Shastri had died a few years after the visit, but didn't know that it had happened when he was the Prime Minister. In January 1966, 3 years after my family was interned, Shastri died in the Soviet Union, a day after signing the Tashkent Declaration to end the 1965 war with Pakistan. So that's why Mom didn't know for more than 50 years that he had become Prime Minister. That's the last of my reading.
So Joy, let me just a couple of questions to raise a couple of points quickly. One is you use the word in the book. I mean, you actually quote it, so but I don't think our readers realize that you quoted it. It's repatriated.
Yeah.
Now, so people say go back to China, or they repatriated to China, but the point that we need to remember is that all these, or most of these families, had nothing to do with China. They were rounded up from within India. They were Indian citizens. So, in what sense did it make to be sending them back to China, and not only that, to be saying that they're being repatriated to a country that they had nothing to do with? Did that thought ever enter your mind, or their minds?
Yeah, the word repatriate was always used, excuse me, whenever people talked about it. But to your point, and to some of the viewers out there, my family had been in India for, I'm the third generation, right? So immigrant or whatever, first generation, then mom and dad were born. And likewise, all the other families were like that. So there were people like me who had never been to China. There were some people had, married their wives from local areas. And so even the children, if you had to go by how people looked, excuse me, didn't look Chinese. But it was fairly, it was interesting because in certain households, if the father or the man was the Chinese person, he would be interned. And then some families went with the father and some families didn't. For instance, in my family's company, only the men went. So only the Chinese men went, and then their families stayed back, and then our company looked after them. So, so yes, the idea of repatriation is, I think, it just, to me, speaks that the Chinese Indians were very much the outsiders, and they were never seen as being part of the country, even though they were clearly born there, ate the food, sing the songs, like really think Indian, if you have to put a term to it. But their upbringing is so so different, right? But yes, that term is used all the time. And
the other thing I wanted to just point out, I was struggling to quickly find it in my copy of the book, but I don't, is something else about Shastri. As you know, he, after this visit to the Deoli camp, he went back to Delhi and reported to Parliament about his visit. Yeah. And he was asked there, so one of the MPs asked him, so, what's the situation in the camp? Some question to that effect. And he said, again, words to this effect, I wish I could have quickly found it in the book, but something about how everybody there is very happy and they're living a very good life and they're happy to be in the camp. And, the thing is that our history books tell us that Shastri was one of our good prime ministers, and I actually believe he was a good man in general and a capable prime minister. But to have this told to us, revealed to us, and it's not, it's in the Parliament record. I mean, what's the word? Archives. That he actually said. To know that he actually said something like this, it does something to you to know that this man was able to go and say this in Parliament. It's so sad,
Yeah, I think I don't have real direct experience of what the Japanese internment camps were, but I think the attitude these wardens have, or the state has, is I'm taking care of you, I'm providing everything for you, you should be fine. It's the state versus the individual, very, very, very bizarre types of behaviors and attitudes. And justifications.
There's a gap I feel between saying, yeah, we're taking care of you, all your needs are taken care of. All right, to some degree that's true. But then to go on from there to say that these families, 3,000 people, are actually happy to be in the camp. I mean, how can he actually say that? How can a prime minister of a country say that? That's the crazy thing.
It is definitely
Anyway.
right. Yes. Okay, Jenna, if there are questions you want to throw out to us.
Okay, we have quite a few questions. The first one is to Joy. From the book, I see that some families were released after 1 or 2 years, but your family was there for nearly 5 years. What determined when you were released?
I think for some of the people who were released earlier, they were sponsored out. Either they had somebody outside outside who could get them out. Like one of the people in the book, Ying Marsh, her mother sort of was able to get her out after like just a few months. But I think that was because they were just 2 children, right? And they were able to come out. They were there without their mom. In my family's situation, we went through, we weren't able to go back to where we came from, which was Hashimara. This is of sort of this area in the tea growing areas near Siliguri, and that the compound or the company was abandoned, and we weren't allowed. Dad was never allowed to go back there. I think Mom was trying to go back to Kalimpong, but Kalimpong was also declared a sensitive area, and if you were to look at all the people who were kept at the end, I don't know what the criteria was. There was this lady who was by herself. There was another family with several children. There was us. We don't have any visibility into why those choices were made.
Totally arbitrary, I think.
Yeah, one would think.
Yeah. They're, okay.
Sorry. And we also got a question to Dilip. So how is the book and its story being received in today's India?
How is the book and the story? Is that
and
what
the
you said?
story, yeah, being received in today's India?
Well, so at one level, I think Joy and I are both grateful that actually we've had a number of very, very good reviews in the papers and our publications, whatever. We've had a couple of podcasts and things like that. We've also done a number of sessions around the book online. I mean, as you can imagine, though, right at the beginning, just before the pandemic really hit, we had a couple of actually live sessions. One in California, as it happens. So at that level, yes, it's been received very well. It even came up the book came up, was on a shortlist for a major award at a Lit Fest last year. So there's that. So the very positive reaction to the book. But what I would like to see actually is more of an effect that the book has, and that I'm not so sure about. Yeah, so sure it is. It's been received well. It's been read, and people have talked about it. But in the end, of course, we would like to see it having some kind of effect on public memory, or much broader level. Of course, public policy, perhaps. Who knows? But or governmental action. Those are very big goals, and whereas I'd like to see us get there. I mean, I really cannot say that the book has had that kind of effect yet. We did have one conversation with a very well-known MP, a public conversation last year, a member of parliament called Shashi Tharoor, who's in the opposition, a Congress politician in India, but he's very well-known, articulate, and raises a number of issues. So, and he did promise us, and we hope to hold him to it, that he would raise this in Parliament, raise the question of an apology to the Chinese Indians. So the thing is that he's been laid up with COVID since then, or at least for the last few weeks. He's recovering, but so as soon as he's up on his feet, I intend to write to him and say, you did make us this little promise. Do you think you could do something about it? So let's see. I'm hopeful that the book will have some kind of effect. I'm glad that people are asking what kind of effect, because it makes us think about that. But the honest answer right now is not a whole lot. Let's leave it there.
Yeah, I would agree with Dilip. I think there was some progress in the beginning because this story was really poorly received in India, and we didn't see that this time when the book was published. In fact, the sort of reactions were more along the lines of what we felt. It's a human tragedy, and there's so much lost time, so much like people carry this with them a lot, and so for people to actually acknowledge that was progress. But as far as beyond that, as Dilip says, we're really looking for an apology, and we're really looking for some acknowledgement first that this was a bad thing.
Yeah.
So we do have another question. Were there other internment camps in India other than the one at Deoli during or after the war?
As far as I know, no, though that doesn't mean there weren't other prisoners, because we've heard stray stories, and I think Joy will back me up and say, of people being put into jail in different cities. I've heard of somebody who was in jail in Bangalore, and I think in Calcutta there were a few people, possibly in Bombay, I don't know. So there were those kinds of imprisonments, but there was, as far as I know, there was no other camp. This was the one, unlike the Japanese Americans who had, I don't know, maybe a dozen camps up and down the West Coast, or maybe more. This was just one in India.
Yeah, Dilip, that's right. I don't think there was another mass kind of prison, but there were people who were locked up in Alipur jail in Calcutta, and yeah.
Okay. Any others?
Have a longer question. It's how many young children were in the camp, and did they have a chance to be educated? What did they do to occupy their time? Is there any entertainment? Was there enough food? Any harsh treatment? Or are they able to resume their life upon release, even though they were released to Calcutta, away from their hometowns?
So we don't have an account of the number of children, but some families are fairly large. So I would say, I don't know, maybe 20%. I'm just taking a wild guess. But there was, the camp had nothing for anybody. There was no structured activities. And certainly for the children, there was no education. So everyone who was in the camp lost all their years and had to start right at the bottom again. And, like in this country, at least, if you have those types of setbacks, you're able to, and this is a different time, there's so many decades later, you can actually advocate for yourself or explain, and, accommodations can be made. But back then, nobody wanted, after coming out of a camp, to say, I was in the camp for 2 years and, I lost, I got to go and start at class 6 again. My brother, he lost 5 years and he had to start all the way at the bottom. He was like the oldest kid in the class. And there was Michael Cheng in the book. He had a hard time going to school, and eventually he just quit. He had to work. It was more important for him to put food on the table, and he started making shoes like his father. Excuse me. Another person, Andy Shea, he was in his last year in school, and he wasn't able to take his exams, and he never talked about finishing it when he came out. He had to work also. So schooling was a terrible thing. They had no teachers. They had, in the end, when everybody left the camp, they hired one of the older boys, like I think they hired Andy, and asked him to teach because he had all his books with him because he thought he was going to go back after a couple of weeks, and he ended up tutoring the little kids. I remember Michael saying something like, "Oh, the teacher taught the same thing over and over again," and then he acknowledged that he didn't have materials even to teach more than whatever he knew. So it was a bad situation for the children.
Other than that, was there like harsh treatment?
Not particularly. There was a riot of some sort. There was some protests from the Internees, so there was a bit of a riot. And yes, people got locked up, surrounded and taken and backed into a jail. So, and there was a lathi charge, like a big stick. So no, not on a daily basis, but if there was an incident, yes, it would happen. But you do have to imagine that this was a barbed wire fence all around, and 24/7, all the towers were manned with guns pointing inward. And then after 6 o'clock, the gates were shut, and everybody who was not an Internee had to get out. And likewise, everybody who was out had to be in again. So it was a prison. It was very obvious that they were in a prison.
Can I add to that? One of the conversations that happens a lot about this camp is, and I've had this with a few people. People say, "Yeah, okay, fair enough. There was this intern, but it went like the Nazi. This was not a concentration camp." So yeah, if you want to make a distinction between concentration camps like the Nazis had and this internment camp. Yeah, there were no gas chambers, and people were not, having their skin flayed off their bodies and things like that. That happened there, sure. But I mean, is that how you define imprisonment? Is that how you define a concentration camp? If so, all right, well, fine. But I mean, I would like to think that a concentration camp really means a place where you're deprived of your freedom for no particular reason. In this case, just for the way you looked. In the Nazis' case, just for the way a lot of the religion those people professed. So, I mean, to that extent, this was a concentration camp, and I think it's good to acknowledge that. I mean, I sometimes feel, even though we use that word, the word internment almost what's the word, downplays what happened to these people. It's not just an internment. It's the taking away of the lives and freedoms of these people for no reason at all. And that's the real disgrace. And call it what you will, that's what we need to remember about this camp.
Okay.
Another question, what caused the original conflict between the two countries, and how long did it last?
Dilip, I'll let you take that one.
Okay.
Since you wrote about it.
Since I wrote about it, okay. Well, how long did it last is what the war itself, as we talked about a little bit earlier in this session, the war itself actually lasted a month. So that's the actual fighting. So, and there was the ceasefire and so on. But if you're asking how long did the conflict last, how long is this tension between India and China lasted, the real answer is that it has never gone away, and the proof of that is that even last year there was a flare up and among soldiers on the border, and that's happening all the time. There's small clashes, bigger clashes, and last year actually there was a clash where about 20 Indian soldiers and some uncounted number of Chinese soldiers died. So this is going on all the time, and it's important to remember that, because that gives us a clue to what the real reason for this conflict is. And the real reason is that the border is just not defined between the two countries, and they both have different perceptions of where the border is. And as soon as you have those different perceptions, each side will claim that the other side is transgressing, and this has gone on now for practically a century. Back in 1919, if I remember right, I don't recall the exact date, there was a treaty that was written between British India, because we were under the British at that time, Tibet and a Chinese representative of the Chinese government of that time, where the so-called border, what's called the McMahon line, was actually supposed to be laid out and defined, though even that's not been defined. And the Chinese side, the guy who came from China to this meeting where this happened, he made a point of how, I don't agree with all this, so I'm not going to sign it, I'm just going to initial it. And that's the truth about it. So not only did that Chinese government not fully agree with what was going on, he just initialed it just to essentially show that I was here when this happened. It's then there's a history after that, right? Because then that government went away, and there was a civil war in China, and then now there's a communist government since then. So certainly the government today, not only do they not recognize that agreement, they don't even recognize the guy who went and initialed it. And so you have to keep all that in mind. And so therefore, there is this constant disagreement about where the border is and how we're going to define what is our territory and what is your territory. And that leading up, in the years leading up to 1962, there were continuous little clashes, and Nehru, who was Prime Minister of India at that time, had something called a forward policy where he would send Indian patrols, he claimed, into what we thought was our territory, but the Chinese thought was a transgression. And at some point, Mao is quoted as saying, if Nehru is going to be doing this kind of thing, so it's only polite to reciprocate. And his reciprocation was to launch this invasion and to push the Indian soldiers back. So the interesting thing about that is that the war actually, that was the war really. The Chinese came into really Indian territory, and then at some point they decided, okay, we've taught the Indians enough of a lesson, and they pulled back to their original positions, and that was the end of the war. So until that border is actually the line is laid out, delineated, or whatever the word is, and marked out on the ground, we're going to continue to have these kinds of, maybe not a full-scale war, but there will be tensions along that border all the time, and that's what we see today. So I'm sorry that was a sort of long-winded answer, but that it is a long-winded question, if you like.
We do have another question here. Are all the Deoliwallahs in contact with each other these days? Since Joy discussing a person who went back to China who still speaks Hindi with his family members.
Yeah, so yes, they know of each other and where people are. So there are different groups. The biggest group is in Toronto, then Vancouver is next. And of course, so Canada actually accounts for the most people who are ex-camp people. There's some in India, and then there are pockets in China because they were taken, they went on the ships back, and then Hong Kong also. So I hear that I haven't been able to meet all of them. I hear that they do have annual gatherings. I was able to meet some people in Hong Kong, definitely Toronto and Vancouver. So, so yes. The people in India are still very afraid, and they're not very outspoken. Just they talk about amongst themselves and within their family circle. There was a woman who spoke to me, and then we anonymized her name because she lives in India, and she was a bit afraid, and we decided we wouldn't publish her name.
And with reason, because this whole the pandemic has also caused tensions now, because it's perceived as this thing coming from China. So again, people who look Chinese are being targeted, and members of that small Chinese-Indian community in Calcutta have had abuse thrown at them and so on. So it's no surprise that she wants her name anonymized.
I think you just answered the next question. Our friend Lena, who's here, asks, what sort of discrimination do Indians of Chinese descent face these days?
Well, let me give a quick answer about that in India, and then maybe Joy can tell you a little bit about the US. So again, after this pandemic started, there have been many reports of, just to give you one example, there's a woman called Jwala Gutta who played badminton for India. I mean, she's a very, very well-known badminton player, one of our top doubles players. So she has a Chinese-Indian mother. And of course, like Joy and like others, looks Chinese. So she tweeted or put out a statement or something right after the whole pandemic started last March or April, talking about how she had been, how people were abusing her or calling her names just because of the way she looked. And she said, look, I'm Indian. I've played for India. I mean, it's not even that I've had to play for India to prove my Indianness, but I am Indian and I have nothing to do with this. So why are you blaming me for this? So that's the kind of thing that happens. And then, to add to that, then there was this tension with China at almost the same time, where I told you about the 20 soldiers who died. So that contributed more again to all this hostility towards China, and again, people who look Chinese were being singled out for attacks or for certainly for abuse. And that's, for example, there have been people who've been asked to leave their apartments because they're from the northeast of India, where they look Chinese, and they said, please, we don't want people like you renting from us anymore. So there's been cases like that. Yeah, Joy.
You remind me, what you said just reminded me that at one point, some minister said to boycott Chinese food.
Yeah.
That I was like, oh, really? And yeah, people are called Corona to their faces. Last year for me, being Chinese American / Asian American was tough. I wasn't the victim of any abuse or attacks, knock on wood, but the rhetoric that was happening, from the leadership was really tough on us, because I think a lot of people, they just get swept with the emotion, and they can't separate the country, China, from the people who are of Chinese descent, and that carries through not only in India, it carries through over here too. So I definitely was very sensitized to people calling out the Chinese for something that was imagined or true, but against the fighting against between the countries, that really does affect us. And you don't have to be Chinese; you just have to look Chinese to be affected.
Yeah, I mean, and there were those attacks on Asian Americans in Atlanta about a month and a half, 2 months ago. So, I mean, that could have been you, Joy, So yeah. You have to face that reality. So
it's absolutely true. Like even my husband was asked if he was from Wuhan. He's walking down like early days of the pandemic down a hotel, and somebody outright asked him, are you from Wuhan? He's like, okay.
You look like that, you must be from Wuhan,
Right.
I think Jenna is trying to say something, but she's on mute.
It's Minnie's turn to ask the next question.
Yeah, we do have next question. So, why was this incident not known? And I think we've been talking about this, but why do you think it's relevant today?
Again, let me take a stab at that quickly. Why is it not known? I really think it's because it's not taught to us in our history books at all. So the vast majority of Indians don't know this happened. We all know that there was a war with China, that we remember, but that this aspect of that war, this fallout of that war is not taught to us. So that's why we don't know. And why did it seems to me almost a conscious decision that our policymakers or whatever took not to do this, not to teach us this. I think that's partly because at some level there's a sense of shame. There has to be, that we did this, and we don't want to acknowledge that. As righteous as we might feel about the war and our position in the war, this is something that was not acceptable, and I think we at some level recognize that. But the real reason perhaps is that this is such a small number of people, 3,000 people in a huge country. and they're a tiny community. Who's there to raise their voices now about this? The Japanese Americans were many more, and they're much more visible, much more vocal community than the Chinese Indians are. And so that's why they got a lot of attention on what happened to them, and they got an apology. So I don't think that applies in India. And that's the reason it's been so forgotten. Joy, do you want to add to that at all?
No, I think it's that definitely what you say is spot on. I also think that because there are a lot of different ethnic communities in India, like within India itself, and then all the people who came from the outside. And so I think this group has always been seen as an outsider. And so when you're not sort of thought of as being part of it, it's easier to sort of to forget and sweep under the table.
I think that is, or those are all the questions that we've received, and it is 7:30. So did you have any other statements to make about the book or anything like that?
I just wanted to say, I think it's true for everybody who's grown up in a place that it stays with you forever. And Dilip's section actually talks about that a little bit, that he was on a bus, and maybe I should let you say this, Dilip, but well, I'll just rattle on a little bit. He was on a bus with a bunch of people from the camp, and they asked this guy to sing a song. And so Dilip's reaction was like, oh, he's going to sing a Chinese song. But he breaks out into this Indian song, right? And so, so all of us, and also the folks in Vancouver and Toronto, they carry India with them. It's a part of who they are. They're born there. I go to these gatherings where this guy is talking in nothing but Hindi, and I'm like, okay, I mean, thank God I understand what you say, but that's his natural, his most comfortable language. And then we're eating all the stuff that somebody bought from, I don't know, these Indian restaurants. And so I think the hurt of being treated the way we and all these folks were treated is very deep. And that's why they carry it so much. If they hated the place, if they hated everything, they wouldn't care about it that much. And I think part of it is for me to, I see that more and more, and every day I still learn a lot about how such an event influences and affects people.
I mean, whenever Joy talks in that vein, it seems to me that the reason I feel I wanted to write this book, and that I'm glad I wrote it with Joy, is that our effort is really to try to get more people to know about this, just so that we will not have to go and, like happened with me, not have to be in some gathering and somebody mentions, this. Did you know that this internment happened? And most of us will throw up our hands and say, no, for God's sake, how did I never know this? How did I never even hear that this happened? At least if you're able to get into go to such a gathering, and if you raise this and people say, yeah, we knew that, and well, we hope it doesn't happen again. Some kind of reaction like that would be better than people saying, no, we never knew about it. And that's the reason we wrote the book. And we're grateful just that we have events like this where more people can find out about it.
Yeah, definitely a big shout out to the Boston City Library for hosting us, and for all of you guys for coming.
Thank you.
And yes, so thank you for coming and sharing your stories and sharing this part of history with us. And for everyone who came tonight to join and shared your questions, yeah, thanks for spending the time with us. If you enjoyed this author event, please check out our future events by going to smcl.org/events. We'd also appreciate if you could tell us how San Mateo County Libraries did with this program, and we'll put a link in the chat for you to rate this event. And otherwise, thanks again, Joy. Thanks, Dilip. And have a good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye, Joy. Bye. Thank you, Jenna. Thank you,
Thank
Mina.
you, Anna. Julie.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good night. Thank you.
All right, bye, guys.
Or a good day if you're in India.
Oh, yes.
Yes, in
Yes, go have breakfast.
Yes.